Om Shanti, a very good evening to everyone and welcome to the Brahma Kumari's weekly Friday talks. And today we have a very wonderful topic, power of tolerance. Definitely, there's one power that's definitely needed in today's world is the power of tolerance. And we have a very inspirational speaker today in Sister Denise Lawrence. Sister Denise has been for over 40 years. And I have to say, she's probably one of the first Westerners who actually sort of dedicated her life to promoting Raj Yoga. And what a transformation she has been from a background in journalism. She's used that skill and exploring knowledge to a very deep but very practical and simple method. And so welcome, Sister Denise from Munich.
Well, thank you so much, Paramjit. It's delightful to be here with you in England.
You're absolutely radiating. You're absolutely brimming with sort of light.
Well, that's great.
Anyway, we had an opportunity to ask questions to Sister Denise. So if you have any questions or comments, please post them on chat and we'll see you later on. So Sister Denise, over to you.
Well, we are going to be talking about the power of tolerance. And this is one of the 8 powers that we study about in Raj Yoga. And usually people think about this as tolerating other people's behavior, tolerating pain, discomfort, difficulties because of COVID or because of heat and cold, climate change. But today I'd like to take this up in a different meaning of the word tolerance. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned use of the word tolerance, but I think it's quite important. And that is to do with things like religious tolerance, racial tolerance, cultural tolerance, because this is quite an important fact that we are all from different backgrounds. And I think a lot of people don't really realize to what extent their background and culture and color of body and race and language and all of these things constitute a filter through which we see each other. And this filter is quite important because it prevents us from seeing each other and accepting each other for what we are. So I want to look at tolerance in this regard of accepting those who are not having the same background, culture, language, etc. as me. And I have lived in many different places. So ever since I was an extremely young child, anyway, I am a child of 2 cultures, having one parent English and the other one French. And someone who's not European would think, well, there's no difference between those 2. But in fact, there's a huge difference. Each European country is a different culture. And within the culture, there's also the religious angle. And you have so many different forms of Christianity in Europe, and your religious background and cultural background are a big filter. So we need to be able to understand each other, and we need to know one another's culture in order to be more accepting and more understanding. You know, I remember when we would cross the channel, the culture would change somewhere in the middle of the channel. This is when we were children. and you would eat differently, talk differently, hold yourself differently. School would be different. Of course, the language is different. The mentality is different. In France, it was more Catholicism. In England, it was Anglican. And so there were huge differences. And as children, we used to be very perplexed that at which point does the culture actually change? Is there a different color in the water as we cross the channel on a ferry? And then I lived in the United States, and many people think, well, Europe and the United States, that's the same thing. Absolutely not. In fact, I found that when I lived in India, the culture and mentality of India was much closer to England than the culture and mentality between England and United States. And then I also lived in Canada for several years, and Canada was again another culture. It is a bilingual country, so there is French and English going on in Canada, so that was fine for me because I was bilingual from childhood. But cross the border and it's a different culture. And then most of my time was spent in Western America, in California, which is a completely different culture from the East and the Middle and the South. And in the United States, there's a very, very big influence of the Hispanic culture. So there was a lot of exposure to that. And it was always better if you could speak Spanish. And then I did also live in India, which is again a rich, extraordinary place. And I traveled a great deal in India. So I became very aware of the far, far east of India, like places like Assam, and then the south in Tamil Nadu and the Punjab and Rajasthan, where our organization has its headquarters. And each place is a different culture, different mentality, different thinking. Although there are some areas where it's closer and some where it's further in terms of differences. And also, I lived in places where it was like South Africa, there's very much of a consciousness of the races, even though apartheid is no longer. There's definitely areas where it's still mostly white and mostly colored and mostly black. And in United States, it's like that also. So I feel that it's rather important for us to take up the matter of the power of tolerance in terms of our relationship with people who come from very different backgrounds from ourselves, because it allows us to broaden and widen ourselves. And it's very important, I've always believed this since childhood, to understand and appreciate people who are not the same as me. And that was quite easy for me to come into that mentality because there was always people who were from different backgrounds around me. And the family I grew up in was very inclusive and without any of these discriminations. But I have been in environments where people really can see you only through that filter, and they see you as something other. And anything that is other, when you're in a prejudiced mentality, anything that's other is negative. So if you eat different food from me, that's bad. If you have a different idea from me about correct behavior and incorrect behavior, then mine is correct and yours is incorrect. And this is intolerance. And I think a lot of people are unaware of the extent to which they are impacted, limited by their angle of vision or their perception, because it's very difficult to see these filters because they're not tangible, they're subtle. And so I think it's important to acquire a sensitivity to that. So when we practice and study spirituality, this is one of the very key points, and that is your identity is not your body. That means it's not your body color, it's not your religion or your language or your nationality or your gender. What is a being? We say a being is a soul, and a soul is ageless, bodiless, genderless, cultureless. It's even actually deathless because the soul is eternal and immortal. And we try to develop consciousness of the self as that. And it's very easy to say, but to actually be that, to actually notice what your filters are and draw aside those veils through which you see someone via that filter. We want to develop a vision where you can see the actual human being, the essence of who someone is, even though you have your filters and they have their filters. So it's a matter of being able to be so subtle and so able to pick up when one of those filters starts operating and causes us not to see the other being as they are. And that's very subtle practice, which takes, I think, your whole life. Because study and practice of the spirit is not like when you go to school, you study for a few years, you get your certification and off you go. Or you go to university, you specialize in something and you get a job accordingly. That's that kind of education. But spiritual education is something different. And it's not really the same as religious education. What is spiritual education? It's deep and it's subtle. And it's there to some extent in all the cultures, but there's always a but. And what I think is really great about the study and practice of Raj Yoga is it very systematically and conscientiously goes to remove every single veil there is. And that's easier said than done, but it's definitely the focus of attention. And I think that also we get very influenced by the people who are around us. So even if you will say for yourself, I don't have any prejudices, I don't judge people on the basis of any of these limitations, but if you're in a community which does, it tends to rub off on you and you don't even notice yourself starting to do the same as others, because we do tend to imitate those who are around us. A lot of people, they like to fit in. They like to be part of. They like to have a sense of belonging. People don't want to be considered eccentric or different. And yet we are very different. And I think what's very important in order for us to develop this power of tolerance is you have to be very confident in who you are as a human being. And this is why we meditate. I mean, there are many, many things that we do in meditation, lots and lots of different things. But I think to sit with yourself and consider, okay, who exactly am I? And we make a difference between what am I and who am I, because what am I is pretty easy to express to yourself. I'm a spiritual being, okay, but then go deeper to who. And the who I am has to do with what your values are. Now, a lot of people think that values are universal, but I studied this quite a bit and I found that they're actually not. But values are definitely according to culture and race and religion and so on and so forth, because values are what the majority of the people of that particular variety consider to be important and that they live by. And there are great variations. So it means that I think importantly, we must put aside the idea of universal values, because what it does is it makes you think that my values are universal values and therefore your values should be the same as my values. And actually it's not a good way to go. I find that it's much better to say, okay, I come from this angle and I have sat with myself to ask myself, okay, what are my personal values? Or I have a name for this, which I use, which is my personal ethical policy, what I think is okay and not okay. Having thought about it deeply, considered it, listened to many different angles on the same point, the same subject, and I create my own set of values and I live by those. But I cannot impose them on somebody else because they also have a right to their values, and their values may be considered or they may be just absorbed from how they grew up, how they were raised, how they were educated. And you can feel a difference between someone whose values are based on deep thought about what they think is right, what they think is real, what they think is good, and then people who haven't really thought it through and they just adopt whatever they grew up with. So that there's a difference in that. And I think also with tolerance, we have to take responsibility for our perception, our perspective. What does it mean to love another human being? And I'm not talking about an emotional feeling. I'm talking about love as an action. And one of my good friends always used to say, love is a verb. And it has to do with the way in which you give of yourself, of your time, of your attention, the way in which you care, the way in which you give respect and regard to another human being, and also where you set your boundaries, because boundaries are very important. And we have a social contract with each other, which is mostly unspoken. And when you sit and meditate and think, if I were really a pure, peaceful, powerful, loveful, blissful being of light, what does that mean in terms of how I come into action through the body and I talk to someone, I listen to someone? Some people you can relate to really easily. Some people, their way of doing things is quite alien to you, but there are still ways of being which are cordial and respectful, but it doesn't mean that you have to leave aside what's important to you in order to accommodate someone else if you seriously don't agree with it. So this question of setting boundaries is a subtle one, because boundaries doesn't mean, you put your hands up and somebody's over there and you create a wall between you and them. Boundaries are limits of how close you get, how much time you spend, what is a subject that you don't talk about, what is a subject you do talk about, how you want the relationship to be. And all of these actually have to be negotiated because our assumptions are not usually exactly right. And meditation also makes us really think and think deeply and makes us question our assumptions, which are to do with tolerance. Some people think tolerance means that you have to accept whatever somebody's bad behavior is and not set a boundary. But I think that's quite dysfunctional. And the world of psychologists would tell you, hey, don't do that. That's really not healthy. And so we have to really think about our definitions and about what is the meaning of tolerance in different situations and in different kinds of relationships. What does it mean in the workplace? You know, do you tolerate people marginalizing you, or do you set a boundary and say, okay, I will be flexible to a certain point, and after that I will call the person to account? And you have to set those boundaries, and once you've set those boundaries, very often there becomes a clash because somebody else has a different boundary than you, and so that creates a clash. And if there's ego involved, then you naturally have an ego clash, which is very often the case. And so what we have to do is really establish and make it clear to those around us what our position is, because that's, I think, quite kind to them, so they know what they're dealing with. Otherwise, people make so many assumptions and they assume that other people have understood those positions exactly as you want them to be understood. But if you don't articulate them, you don't verbalize it, then there's a lot of opportunity for misunderstanding and getting into quite sorrowful situations. So we need to be aware of the value of really saying to ourselves, okay, this is my policy and this is what I will do, this is what I won't do. And that's that. Because there are so many differences, we need to learn how to discuss it with each other and put it into words. And that can be quite difficult because you don't want to offend the other person. Sometimes you can say something which seems perfectly inoffensive to you, but the other person will take offense because in their culture, saying something like that in that way is considered bad. So, of course, we have to go through the process of making lots of mistakes, and that is life, and we have to get these things sorted out. But I think that putting oneself in the position of someone who interacts with people of different backgrounds and cultures and who has really learned how to be just human to human, you know, and that's really what spirituality is. And we have other powers that we talk about in Raj Yoga, along with the power of tolerance. And none of these powers really exist in isolation. When we analyze them, we take them apart and look at them separately, but actually they all go together. And tolerance is very connected with being flexible and being open and willing to listen, to give a lot of time to listening, because it's by listening that you pick up what's important for the other people around you. And then there are there come times where what they think is okay and you think is not okay, and you have to think, okay, do I bend because they don't know that it's not okay in my understanding, or do I, set my boundary and say, okay, now for me that's not okay. So we need to agree that you will appreciate, you will respect that for me, this is not okay. And we have to be able to say that. I think in the past, it was considered quite bad to articulate these things. And so one would be educated not to do that. But I think now it's quite accepted that you must do that because there is such a mixture, such a salad bowl. And a salad bowl means there's different fruits and vegetables, and they don't mix together like a soup. They do retain their separate integrity. And I remember when I lived many, many years in Los Angeles, which people used to talk of as a jigsaw puzzle because there were 84 languages spoken in the school system. And every few miles or within 1 or 2 miles, you would have a different community. And what happens in a land of immigrants, some are from a long time, several generations, some are new immigrants, and there are waves of immigration in the United States. It's always been like that. And now I think in Europe, people are having to deal with the question of immigration and big influx of refugees, which has created a lot of upset because people are not used to that. But in the United States, it's all about waves of immigrants and integrating into something which is called American, which is very difficult to define because it's made of so many different things. But living in a city like that, which I did for 30 years, made me very comfortable with people of all different kinds and different languages and different foods and so on. And so I became very easily able to be comfortable in any different cultural environment. Now, this is called a power. What happens if you are weak in tolerance, and why is it something that we need to work with? And how do you work with it if you're weak in it? So one thing I think you have to do as an individual, and when you're meditating, go really deep inside and ask yourself the question, what is it that I'm prejudiced against? And it could be anything, because people have something that they draw the line at, which is prejudice and not something that is a realistic boundary. And when you've found that, then you need to ask yourself, okay, why? What is it about you that makes you intolerant towards a particular group of people? Now, one group that experiences a lot of intolerance is people who are mentally handicapped. And on one level, we would say, well, it's karma. And of course, everybody has something which is karma, but it's not an excuse to say, well, I am prejudiced against people who are mentally handicapped because, they shouldn't be like that, or whatever your reason is. But if you notice you're prejudiced against a particular group of people, or I've sometimes experienced that people who've come from different parts of the world where there was a colonial presence, and then they become prejudiced against the people who had colonized that area. And then they will say, well, we in our culture, we don't like this particular other culture. And then they will be very strong in that. And this is because they grew up like that. And then when they move out of that country and move into another country, which they're prejudiced against, but yet they are there for making a new life, having financial opportunities that they don't have in their own culture, but then they will bring that weakness with themselves and stay in that community who are similar to themselves, and they will continue with that prejudice. And it doesn't work if you do that when you're living in the place that you're prejudiced against. And so you have to really think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And is it valid? And to what extent is your evaluation of a person based on your experience of that person? And to what extent are you projecting onto that person on the basis of an acquired prejudice that you grew up with? And for many people, they don't notice it. They don't see it because they're so used to it, you can't tell. And I found a very interesting situation, a very interesting experience that I had. I was living with a group of people that were, every single one was from a different religion, a different race, a different culture, and we all spoke English more or less, but it was really interesting because there was no number that was a majority. Every single one was equally a minority in regard to all the others. And this was very interesting because in that situation, you could really, really tell when an interaction was based on a perception that was prejudicial. And it was a very, very interesting experience because you had to be really soul conscious and really see the other as a soul and notice where their cultural angle and your cultural angle clashed. But you had to move to the commonality of the spiritual brotherhood. And that was very important because it enabled you to notice what your prejudices are. Because if you're with people who have the same ones, then you think there isn't one. And then you're not able to develop the power of tolerance of that particular type. You're not able to have religious tolerance. You're not able to have cultural tolerance because you can't see it. So coming or being in a situation where you are with, everybody's different, like vastly different, then it puts you in, I think, an ideal position to find your spiritual center and make contact with your identity that is independent of these things that you grew up with. Now, I'd like to bring in the word sanskar. And this is a word that is used quite a lot, but it's used with different meanings by different people. And we use the word in the spiritual practice of Raj Yoga quite a lot. We say that a soul has a mind, an intellect, and all sorts of good and bad sanskaras. And we classify them as good and bad, so that's okay. But let's look at it a little bit more deeply, a little bit more realistically. And mostly people think that your sanskaras arise because of your karma. So your sanskaras, your tendencies and the way you do things and your talents and so on. But it's also, your sanskaras are your cultural prejudices. This is one of the meanings of sanskaras. And then you will operate according to those cultural prejudices or racial prejudices or religious prejudices, and that will be called sanskaras. And so when it is said, change your sanskaras, you will say, oh, how do I do that? And what are sanskaras anyway? And which ones should I change? And are they individual things or what? So it becomes quite difficult for a person to actually work with sanskaras. But if you think of the word sanskaras as being pretty much synonymous with the values and the prejudices and the feelings, the perceptions and the attitudes that come from a cultural bias, then it becomes something that you can actually work with and say, some behavior that you have or something that you think is important, which isn't, or something that you think has to be and it doesn't have to be. These sanskaras can be changed, because as soon as you see that you're under the influence of a cultural bias or a prejudice, once you see it, you don't do it anymore. But it's very easy to revert back because you've got to be attentive. Sanskaras are deep tendencies that you grew up with, that's part of your identity that you can't see. And a situation happens which makes them visible. And that's really important. So we find ourselves very often in these tricky situations where there's a clash of culture. And a lot of people say this is a clash of individual sanskaras. No, it's a clash of culture. And you look at the individual when you don't see that they're the way they are, not because of themselves individually or their individual karma, but because of how they were raised and the different social attitudes that they adopted without thinking. Because, you breathe it in with the air, and it's comes with your food and your dress and your thinking and education, and all of these things are there. You think this is just the way things are. This is the way people are supposed to be. And then you don't think of it as a sanskar that could possibly be changed. So this is something I think quite interesting to consider, to look at tolerance in this way and look at yourself and ask yourself, are you tolerant in the sense of, are you open? Are you accepting? Are you able to see past the things that are like barriers, cultural barriers or veils? You have yours and the people around you have theirs, and you want to go and move all these veils so that it's really soul to soul, and you see the person's heart, you see the person's being, you see their intention, and you love them because they're another human brother. And even you go beyond the gender, brother, sister. That is a big barrier, the gender barrier, because the soul is genderless. And you have to think about that, because most of this intolerance is connected with the way you see another person through your eyes. You see their gender, you see their color, you hear their language, and all of this makes you say, I'm dealing with this, but you're not. You're dealing with something much more subtle that lies behind that. So we have to train our eyes. And for that, we talk about the third eye, the eye which understands what lies behind what's visible and takes that to be the real thing. So a few points about tolerance, maybe some of them may be new to you, but I will stop there And I know that you may have some questions, and then later we'll have a meditation together. So thank you, and Om Shanti.
Thank you very much, Denise. Interesting insight into the power of tolerance. Just thinking that you've been very lucky in that you're multilingual, because people may not be aware, but Denise actually speaks Hindi fluently and writes it as well. So you've interacted people with all backgrounds, as you say. You're from you've got a French background and an English background, and so I would assume you find it very easy to tolerate people of different colors, different cultures, etc. But what about people who are stuck in their own sort of closet of same color, same culture, and suddenly there's an influx, as you can see with the current situation in the Middle East, just in Afghanistan? You know, there is a fear. How do they change their culture? How do they go into tolerance?
Well, that's going to be difficult, and it depends very much on the media, because the media, and I used to work in media, I work in it all the time, the media will reflect what people are thinking, and it may also adjust what they're thinking. And that depends on who controls the media and their social attitudes and so on. So it's political, it's social, and what is a realistic thing? Not an easy thing to digest, but realistic is it takes 3 generations for someone who's an immigrant to actually integrate into a new society. 3 generations. So what will happen is the refugees will come, and they're traumatized by war, and they cannot understand the language, and it's very, very difficult for them to learn it because they don't have contact with people who speak the local language. I'm in Germany, and there was a large influx of people from Syria, and I have contact with quite a few of the refugees, and this is their problem. They cannot learn German because they speak only Arabic amongst each other, and they don't have any contact with any Germans, and Germans don't want any contact with them. And it's very difficult to meet people who are different from your own people. So these are really practical situations. And then you get...
Internet. Oh, we're back.
You get somebody who badly behaves, and then the media fires it up, and then everybody assumes that everyone is like that, you see, because we have this habit of generalization, you see, and we say all Syrians are terrorists. Well, maybe 1 or 2 might be, but what about, most people are not, the most people are, they like peace, they want to be community, but there are difficulties, and how to deal with those difficulties, it takes time, it takes a lot of people, and there are a lot of people who really help the refugees to integrate, but it's very difficult at the school. Sometimes the teachers don't like people who are different, and then the other school kids also don't like. And it's not an easy thing. So we have to be very kind, very patient, very open, one by one, and try to be good examples.
Now, what about the aspect of introducing spirituality into this? I mean, you said, yes, we have to try and integrate with others. We have to be kind to others. But how can spirituality speed up that process?
Well, people don't really want to hear what you have to say about spirituality because they don't want lectures and they don't want to be imposed on. So really, you have to be someone that they can feel as spiritual. And you have to give it time because they have to trust you. And it's really, I think the key is patience and being loving. And this is really the essence of spirituality, isn't it? It's peace, it's love, it's openness, it's generosity, it's being in your power, and creating an atmosphere where people feel safe and comfortable, and then their barriers fall down and they come close. And that's the way that I find is the best.
Somebody's pointed out in pain and conditions of extreme sensory stimulations, they practice this soul conscious stage, but they quickly get into the vices and deteriorate. In many ways, that's you're describing is that those sanskars that you mentioned earlier on, they're sometimes so difficult to shift. What can we do to sort of keep that change going in the right direction?
Well, again, it's very easy to say this should be like this and that should be like that, and you should change in 5 minutes time. But no, it's a lifetime work. And as I said before, it's sometimes generations are needed. And the thing that is difficult for people is to be patient and to understand that these things take time, and you have to be in your power, because if you take spiritual power into yourself, you will not be set off so easily as if you don't. Like we experienced during the COVID restrictions, during the first few months of COVID restrictions, I was in the United States and we were in total lockdown. And I noticed that it was very, very difficult for other people who were not in the spiritual practice to handle confinement at home. But for us who are in spiritual practice, we could handle it. We could handle each other, and we could handle, food restrictions. You couldn't go out, you couldn't go shopping, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. So you had to be like really tolerant of those situations. And because we have done a spiritual practice over a long period of time, it's been an accumulation of this flexibility, this power of tolerance that kind of comes bit by bit. You don't always see it coming because it's invisible.
So you practice that spirituality, and obviously, as you said, you've experienced the benefits of that, especially during the COVID. So what can we do to sort of change others? I know you said I'm not here to change others, but you said, sometimes there is an influence because of people's culture. So how can we contribute to a positive change?
Well, I think we have to really focus on being, and people are looking for examples of this. And when they see someone who is bright and at ease and peaceful and tolerant, they observe that person over a time, and they gravitate towards that way of being because it corresponds to something they're looking for. But you don't need to necessarily tell them you should be like this and you should be like me and things like that. It's kind of a wordless message of just being. I find that works rather well.
Has there been a go-to person that's inspired you? And if so, what has been the attraction?
Well, I know people from all over the world, and I have a large, large circle of friends who are all interested in spirituality. Some are, full-on Raj yogis, and some are just people who are spiritually inclined, and they don't want to classify themselves as one thing or another. But I've also had in my lifetime close relationship with some of the most powerful and influential yogis in the world. And of course, feeling them, seeing them, talking with them, living with them has been an incredible influence, because there's a continuity, there's a stability, there's a power in their beings that you can feel. And say, I want to be like this, and that's that. You know.
I think Denise, you've also been a wonderful example. I have to say, meeting you in person, I find your way of thinking is very simple but very deep, very profound. So I think, like you say, is when you're being it, you're more likely to change others. And I did like the aspect that it's just practice, 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 isn't it? Um,
Yeah.
is there what are the barriers to sort of really bringing out the power of tolerance?
Well, the barriers are, if you have obstacles. Everybody has obstacles. Everybody has like dark periods in their life where they get fed up with it, or they lose faith. All these things happen, and then your level goes down, and then you see the effect, and you say, "No, I must bring myself back up," and you realize that you must do it, and you make it a personal policy that you will persist in your endeavors, and it's a lifetime thing. So the barrier is, you may get ill, you may have a lot of opposition, people don't like you, they don't recognize you, they don't appreciate you, they don't respect you, whatever. Don't take it personally, don't use it as a reason to give up your practice, and just know that you must continue, because it's like one time, Daddy Yankee, she used to say, I'm like an airplane pilot. And I'm not just doing this for myself, but there's all these other passengers in the plane. And if my stage goes down, everybody else goes down with me, She would give these metaphors that would make us aware that, these are invisible energies. And once you start to capture them, it becomes like a responsibility. You have to do this. That is part of the function of your life. And so you have to respect that in yourself.
Sometimes when people say you have to show more tolerance, you have to be more accepting, whilst we can sort of inculcate that, but there's always sometimes negative comments from others, because they can say, well, you've been doing this for years and I don't see the change. How do we cope with that?
Well, I consider it as a big joke, you see. That's much better. And you say, have a nice day, It's none of your business what I am.
Okay. I think coming back to tolerance, in today's world, there's so much intolerance, and the consequence of that is so much suffering and sorrow. So I think, how can we sort of promote positive vibrations to the atmosphere? How can we help those who are helpless themselves?
Well, I think we just have to continue to radiate, because the sun is a perfect metaphor for this. It shines. Sometimes there are clouds, but the sun is shining the other side of the clouds. So if you want to see the sunshine, you have to get above the clouds. And sometimes it's nighttime, and the earth is facing a different direction, but the sun just carries on shining. And we have to do that too, and not be concerned about clouds and night and windstorms and all this stuff. And I think tolerance is also part of that. You get through it. It's sometimes you need to use the word endurance. You have to endure, and you have to get through. I use this expression, the power to keep on going. Just keep on going no matter what. That's I find that a good expression to use for myself when times get tough, and they do get tough. Of course they do.
I think someone's commented, have faith in yourself and trust your instinct.
Well, that's right. Absolutely.
I think it's a good opportunity now, if you can lead us into meditation, so we can experience that deep sort of tolerance of our own selves and spreading that tolerance to the whole world. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you. So turn your attention within. you can see this point of light on the screen. Let your eyes rest on that white light in the middle. And just bring your attention inside your own being to feel yourself as light. Let your thoughts slow down. Be focused and internalized. Feel peace. Know that I am a peaceful light. I am a loving being. And all the people that I see are actually points of light, at peace. There is no clash between one peaceful light and another. There is no clash between a radiance of purity and a radiance of love. Remember what you are, who you are. And turn the mind above and beyond to the great light of the divine. A huge energy of spiritual light. Connect with that and open yourself to that light. Let it fill you with its strength and beauty. Let it empower you so that you can live as you would like to be. Feel the stillness and serenity of your being while you absorb light and strength from the Supreme Being. Then gently let yourself return to the everyday world filled with that strength. Om Shanti.
Thank you for that, Denise. It's always a wonderful experience listening to you. I do enjoy your TV show where you have your chit chat on the various philosophies, parts of Raj Yoga. Very insightful, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on today's topic of the power of tolerance. It's been some time since we've had you, since last October, and we do hope that you can come back again, but this time a little bit sooner rather than later.
Definitely.
And we'd like to thank all our participants who joined, and thank you for your comments as well. Comments again, thank you for your interesting talk. Om Shanti, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Great session. Thank you. I like the point you share, be in your power. So obviously, positive feedback. Next week's topic is the art of remaining contented and happy with Maura Lowe from Argentina. And we do hope that you can join us. We're just putting it on your screen now. So once again, thank you for attending this talk, and thank you to our participants, and especially Denise, Shanti Denise.